Welcome everybody, the Power Lunch. This week we have a little bit of a different format in that it'll be a panel discussion. We've done panel discussions before, but we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion, and we're going to be talking about issue response and some of the things around issue response, some of the things we should think about. So for today, we have joining us Paul Barrett, founder of NetVPro. And we have Frank Dickinson, who is an expert in the IT space. Maybe Frank, if you want to give, everybody probably knows Paul, so we'll start with Frank.
Yeah, sure.
Sadly, but Frank, if you want to give a little bit about who you are and your experiences, and then Paul, after Frank, why don't you give a little bit of high level of who you are? Nobody cares about who I am. I'm just a dancing monkey. So you guys want to just give us a high level overview. Frank, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a degreed engineer from Rensselaer Polytechnic up in New York. Engineering, computer and systems engineering, going way back. So I've worked in IT pretty much my entire life since college and even before college. I guess I started programming when I was 11. So, and back in those days, it was hard to find a computer to program on. So, but most recently I was at a company, a marketing services company, 2,400 people, as their chief technology officer. So I was responsible from everything from cybersecurity to software development I often said my title was not CTO, I was CBO, in charge of everything broken. So it was my job to fix any problems that came up.
If it has a plug on it, you're responsible.
Exactly. And, I think people in IT can probably sympathize with that a little bit, because everything nowadays is on a computer, and everything on a computer seems to be a technical problem. So, so you tend to get sucked into kind of fixing everything. So, working across multiple geographies, we were in India and the Philippines and the US, as well as some independent developers in Serbia and other places. We did have our challenges in terms of trying to keep the environment safe. We did do that pretty effectively. But we still had things come up from time to time that were kind of interesting. So, and hopefully we'll get to a few of those things today.
Awesome. Very good. And then Paul, you want to just give a little high level on who you are and what makes you awesome?
Yeah, I'm Paul Barrett. I started this company 11 years ago. What makes me awesome? I started this company and brought on the fabulous Keith Swingle. So, what can I say? That is my crowning achievement.
I'm the Randy Montgomery Savage of IT.
The panel's supposed to suck up to the host. Is that what we're supposed to do?
Well, I would say yes.
Well, no, I usually do the opposite, and I run him down. So he's just like,
yeah, I'm completely confused right now.
It's the positive versus negative thing. He's just like,
it's that thing where your older brother holds your hand and says to pull on it, and you put yourself in the face and wait for that part to happen.
So yeah, I mean, we're all about trying to bring value. And the latest thing is like, hey, if we really should think about, everybody's saying it's not if, it's when. I believe it's not when. We can, it's more of, can we detect it? How do you detect it? I mean, what really brought this all about is, we had a customer, it's like, I'm being hacked. And I'm like, okay, are you being hacked? How do you know you're being hacked? So that's what, brought this genesis of, hey, let's start thinking about, how do we respond to that kind of thing? But yeah, I've been in IT for 31 years. I started programming at age, I think 11 with a Commodore VIC-20. So it's kind of crazy.
So, did you actually program when you were using your Fred and Barney Rubble car on the way to school, or a car with your feet?
Yeah, the car with
have internal combustion engines when you were young.
Well, we had internal combustion engines. Yes, I didn't have brakes, so I would steer into the ditch or whatnot to stop.
Thanks.
Still a good strategy. Works today.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, there's no ditches around here. There's just cement walls, so it's really
See,
not
canals.
as effective. Canals too, yeah. So
I had a brother-in-law who built a
Channel with
go-kart.
alligators.
Yeah, alligators. I had a brother that built a go-kart that was like that. You had to put your feet down on the outside to stop it. It was really hard on your shoes. But well, thank you guys for being part of the panel. And I guess one thing I would like to remind everybody is this is a conversational format. If you have a question, please ask it. If you have a comment or a contribution, please feel free to share. We're a community of people who are interested in technology and the associated accoutrements to technology. And this is one of those times where we can share some knowledge and think about it and help learn from each other. So if you have something to add, feel free to do that. So I guess let's kind of get into it, start thinking about incident response. And one of the things that I wanted to kind of throw out there is that when we think about incidents, I think that the concept of an incident has changed over the past few years in IT. I think that in the Midwest, people used to think of an incident as being something like a killer tornado or some kind of a event like that, and maybe for our southern friends, a hurricane. Those types of things were an incident. But I think that the description of an incident now could be expanded to think of ransomware, crypto lock type stuff, even things that are power and grid related. If your business has been disrupted one way or another, it's an incident. I guess I would kind of throw it to Frank and see if you agree with that or have different thoughts around that, or what you think about those things.
Yeah, I don't think I think in a broad sense, I don't think it needs to be security related necessarily. And I think a lot of the elements of what you need to do are exactly the same, right? You're still trying to troubleshoot what the underlying issue is as quickly as you can. You're trying to figure out where the problem is. And as modern as systems are today, and as many monitoring solutions as you can put in place and everything else, sometimes you're still eluded by problems that simply do not report themselves, and I think that's why we still need people in information technology who understand the systems and how they're put together. And I can think of even more basic examples, switches that go bad, they don't completely fail, but they're not completely up. And, some traffic is passing and other traffic is not, I don't know. We've probably seen that 3 or 4 times, throughout my career in different companies. And, those are always baffling because you simply just don't understand why things aren't working the way they're supposed to, and what you need to do about them. So I would put that all into an incident response. And I've also within my career seen essentially the third world in India develop, over a 15-year period. And, it underscored the difference between what we in the US look at in terms of normal operating procedures versus the rest of the world as well. So we had an executive come over and say, well, you've got backup generation here. And I'm like, of course we do. And they're like, well, how often do you test it? And I'm like, every day. Because literally we had a power outage at least once a day, usually 2 or 3 times a day, where we had to kick on our generators. And so I think they are all incidents. I think you respond to them in a lot of ways exactly the same way, with some notable differences. And I think, looking at geography is also important in terms of where people have their priorities in terms of what they're focused on, and what, sometimes that's a distraction and sometimes that actually makes them better and more able to react to things.
Right. Yeah, I think that it's interesting to me how much more, the security piece is obviously, top of mind for everybody, and it's a concern for everybody, and kind of has the freak out factor. It's interesting to me how much more utility related issues have become incidents. It's interesting to me how the, I don't know if I want to say it's fragile, but impacts to our grid are something that we as IT leaders or business leaders need to contemplate in our day-to-day existence. It used to be that, maybe you had a power outage because of a storm, maybe, or, one little this or that would happen, and maybe your generator got exercised twice a year if you weren't doing it. You know, I mean, maybe.
Right.
You know, in my past, you know, I'm an old IT person as well. Paul's way older, but you know, I remember times where the generator, when I wasn't responsible for it, let's just say, wouldn't run, right? You wouldn't know if it would run, you know, and in today's world, that's just not a reality. The generators need to be exercised, and you know, incidents happen with more regularity. So yeah, it's kind of, to me, that's an interesting thing. And I think that when we think about incident response, you know, it's kind of one of those deals where, absent a plan, it makes me think of the Muppets, because I think about the Muppets a lot, right? But it's,
Right.
what was that character, Beaker, who would used to run around when something bad would happen, go beep 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 beep. They'd bump into each other and they'd do all those types of things, and that's really what we want to avoid, I think, is that feeling of panic and running into each other, bumping and being disorganized. And I think that we want to transition to a place where it's an orderly operation.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah, go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, just a couple comments. One, to piggyback on what Paul said, you know, it's not if it'll happen, but when it'll happen. And one thing I try and do to help people understand that, they'll say, well, I'm not as big as Home Depot. I'm not Sony. Nobody's going to bother me. And I say, you're right. The guys that are hacking into Sony and Home Depot probably aren't going to bother the small little business. You're not worth it to them. But keep in mind, they didn't start at that level. You know, they started on the smaller businesses. They started in what I call like the AAA league and built their way up to the big leagues. So you've got a lot of people in there, and you guys are easy targets because you have this attitude, it's just not going to happen to me. And just as a side note, about 17, 18 years ago, I was a director of IT for a leasing company, and we had our annual auditors come in, and they asked us a question which is relevant to today, but we had no real answer at the time. They're like, what happens if you have a pandemic? We're like, what? When's the last time that happened? But
Yep.
Now, I mean, you're surrounded about all this. Like, what's going to happen if, you know, the next variant of something comes out and you're not ready for it? So this was maybe hopefully a big wake-up call for all that.
Yep, that's a very good point. And in some of the processes in a past life, pandemic planning was part of it. And you're 100% right. People were like, what? You know,
Who's going to plan for that?
Poo-poo that thing. And all of a sudden, yet here we are.
Yeah.
You know,
I think Ken, to your point, you know, I think we've learned this in the last few ransomware attacks that, yeah, they were going after, you know, potentially bigger targets, but it really kind of showed also the need for the people who are doing the hacking to get funding, right? To basically pay themselves through their activities so that they could keep hacking, right? And you can be a strategic target, a big fish that they're going after, but you're also likely to be a target of opportunity if you make it easy for them, right? And so I don't think you want to be, you know, you want to have reasonable protections in place for the type of business that you're running. You certainly don't want to leave anything exposed that you can tie off and keep someone from getting into. But it needs to be, you need to have a measured approach, I think, to what you do and make sure that you're not undergunning your response for sure, because you could just as easily be a target of opportunity. You know, if they get $10,000 out of 100 people or $1 million out of, you know, one person, I don't think it matters. They just want the money, right?
And, you know, you look at the T-Mobile hack, what just happened there, supposedly was some kind of semi-rookie, we'll call him. But he found one router that they had on their network. So it's kind of like going back to what Paul said. How do you know? One router that wasn't secure, and that's how they got in.
Yeah, and that's always the challenge in IT, and that's what I would tell everybody. I said, it's, you know, it's my job to basically make sure that every hole is plugged, but it's the job of the hacker to simply find one that's open, right? And it makes it very, very challenging. So for sure.
Right. So, you know, from a high level, just to kind of start macro and maybe grow micro, what do you think incident planning should look like? Not in great detail, but, you know, is it a multidisciplinary team? Is that one person who gets to carry the 500 pounds all day long? Or what do you think that in incident planning when you think about what does that look like?
Organization. How big is your organization? I do think you need to have all facets of the business involved, not just the IT department, but the management, accounting, and all these things that have to come together and have to work on how are we going to respond to this and get past this.
Right. I do agree with that. And if I look back at every issue that I ever encountered, right, there was always a level of communication that happened through sales and customer support, like just for example, or maybe through operations. I think the accounting aspect of it is important as well, because sometimes sometimes you're violating your SLAs and you're going to owe people some money for what happened. So I agree, but it was also the case that very few people run into the burning house, so it was difficult in the moment to get people on board with some of the things they needed to do. And I think that goes back to the fundamental thing, which is plan, prepare, have a plan, and let people know ahead of time what you're going to expect of them if a problem does occur, because just as much as your team's working through the issue, you need to have a checklist and a run book and a playbook and all of that to get through it fast and get to the root issue quickly. Getting everybody on board ahead of time with your plan is also really, really important.
Yeah, HR still needs to get payroll out. Accounting still needs to pay the bills and collect payments. The business still has to be able to function, even if it's at a degraded level. It's still got to be able to function basic things to keep it in business. I forget what the number is, but it's pretty high. Like most businesses that have an attack are usually out of business within, I think it's 5 years. It's a high number because there's no planning. Hopefully nowadays that has changed with the advent of ransomware. Really, people are really having to be careful about that.
Let me ask this question, and if you're an individual who's done some of the planning before, it's probably a little bit of a self-evident thing, but I'm going to ask it for the sake of asking it. And do you think that as you come up with an incident response plan that it should be tested, or is it? So do you think incident response planning is a journey or a destination?
It's more of a journey. When I was with Marlon again, we had a SunGuard, I think it was, our remote site, and all our backups were stored there. So if we had to do anything, if we had an incident, we had a place to go and fire everything up. And we had seats and everything there for people. And it would have been rotating on the clock 24/7. But every year we would go there and do a simulation. Okay, we've lost everything. How do we get everything back up? And how do we function? And it was just constant. And the first year it was horrible. So, we went back, we looked at what we did wrong. The next year we went back, updated our directions and our plans, and it wasn't horrible. By the third year, we were very successful and rapidly redeploying our primary network tools.
Right, or one of the tricks we used was we basically outfitted our primary and our secondary site to mirror each other. And it was more expensive to do that. But the benefit was we could run on either one and we could shift between them whenever we wanted to. And so we always knew the secondary site was viable. Mm-hmm. So the other way to do it is try to incorporate it into the way that you work within your operations so that you know that you have a resource that's there and always good, right? I think that one of the challenges, though, I definitely think it's a journey to your original question, Keith, though, because you're always learning things. Like every time you go through an exercise, there's and it's always the same response. Well, we didn't expect that. It's like, well, of course, that's why we tested it. If you don't test it, you never get to that point, right? So, but it was always the same response, or it wasn't supposed to work that way.
I think,
or it didn't work that way when we tested it the first time, or, I mean, the responses are always the same, right? So, yeah, testing is definitely part of it, and the feedback loop, and that's why it's a journey. The feedback loop is absolutely important because, your company's changing too. Think about that. Your company's growing while you're doing all of these things. A lot of times, you're adding. How many SaaS applications get added per year in any company right now? So think about that, is that you're not even controlling the infrastructure necessarily anymore. And, are all of those things still going to be accessible in the same way if you shift over to a different site or facility, or, and some of them have benefits because you don't host them and somebody else can get to it a different way. But there are still systems you integrate into your back office that you need to reach, and you have to test all of that as well. So I think it's definitely a journey. I don't think anybody, certainly if you look at the big companies out there that have gotten breached and have the budget and the huge staffs and everything else, they're not necessarily any safer, any more locked up than smaller companies are.
Right. And I think, I'm in the role that I'm in, I'm lucky, maybe lucky isn't the right way to describe it, but I'm surprised at how often the initial testing, right? The initial, hey, are these the right things process identifies that these aren't the right things for us to be thinking about. How often a course correction really does happen. And one of the things that I think it's important to have is a test plan, right? So that you identify the things that are important to the various operational units within the business. You develop your test cases and document, and what the result was. Is it an expected result or an unexpected result? And in that first series of testing, it's surprising how often you get an unexpected result. I think that, one of the other things I wanted to talk about a little bit is, in your experience or in the experience of the panel, how about identifying the critical path items? Because it's typical for there to be a couple of people in a business who know a lot about the business or who are important to the business. But how do you ensure that you're capturing critical processes, critical customers, critical contact points? Because we're talking about incident response, which is broader than just disaster recovery. It's incident response. So how do you make sure you're capturing all of those important elements?
It's where you're bringing the entire business into this planning process, because accounting has a different thought on what is important to sales, to the IT department, to collections, and all different things like that. And everybody has to have some kind of ownership of it, and everybody has to be involved in the escalation paths up and down. Hey, we need this work. For us, it was InfoLease, which managed the leasing application completely. So InfoLease was the most important. Goldmine was our Salesforce version of what our Salesforce would be. And they were the two primary things. And email, all three of those things had to come up almost immediately. And then the other things, the accounting department, we could bring them up a little bit more slowly. Who has to work during the day? Well, everybody wants to work during the day, normal business hours. But out of a company of 300 people, we had maybe 50 seats that were available to us at any given time. So who's going to probably work during the day? Sales. Accounting, sorry, you're going to have to work at night. Some of those other things. And there's a lot to work out in advance. So you take all the politics out of it way up front, and everybody knows what their role is and what they're going to have to go through.
I think, Keith, another good strategy is to try to automate recovery on certain things as well. So for certain systems where we needed to switch things over, we'd almost always start with a process and say, okay, here's the 10 steps you need to do. And then we would think, okay, well, how can we automate that? How can we write a script that does those 10 steps and checks things appropriately so that we could effectively have resources that maybe didn't have as broad or deep understanding of certain things, execute processes to recover. That always is, has its issues and, things to look at. But I think that's part of the process as well, is you want to figure out how to take the knowledge and expertise and not be so reliant on it and get it into resources that are centralized and manageable by other people within the organization. So, we had scripts to fail over servers and move databases and, do different things to help us get back on track. Even something as simple as, if we needed to if we needed to update our DNS to point to a different location or something like that, we had scripts that would go in and just, kind of blast out all the new IP addresses. That's little things that end up, taking a lot of time. And one of the reasons why we scripted that is because we did have a problem, and it was me sitting there updating the DNS records one at a time. And I'm like, I just, first of all, it was 4 a.m. You know, another thing is incidents never happen at a reasonable time, right?
At a convenient time.
Yeah. So I don't know how many times I've been on a call with people in the middle of the night, and literally you hear someone snoring, and you're like, dude, wake up, we got to fix this, right? Or I get people literally that are just at the end of the rope. I've been up, 36 hours straight. I just can't do it anymore. And you're sitting there giving them a pep talk, so these are like all the realities of when this stuff happens. But, it's always feeding back those lessons.
I actually think that's a great point. I think that's a great point. And that is fatigue. When you're in an incident, if you're managing through an incident, there are humans. So maybe part of your incident plan is contemplating the fact that it's not all hands on deck. If it looks like it's going to be a protracted event, maybe you want to start cycling your team through so people are able to get rest. I have had a couple of instances where we had a protracted event, and you can't have everybody needing to sleep for a few hours right in the middle of it. So being able to identify and understand the fact that humans need a break, and getting, someone takes a break while someone else takes the burden, and then switch roles, and so you can get that going. But I think that's a great point of something that we don't intuitively contemplate when we're sitting down with the business operational units and thinking about that concept of cycling people through in an event. Even in my past, I had a tornado event happen. I was on a village board, and we had a tornado destroy our town. Well, that was a multi-day event. I mean, to the point where for the businesses in our environment, all that we had was toilets screwed on cement slabs. And what do you do there? And when a multi-day event happens, the contemplation of being able to cycle resources through is an important thing.
Let me a two more real world examples that happened to me, right? One is an incident that happened at just like 9 o'clock at night, right? I had to pull somebody in who had expertise in the system, and through no fault of their own, that maybe they had a few too many glasses of wine with dinner, right? So think about that, right? Those people are not necessarily working those hours. You do need them to help resolve the problem, but it's on their free time a lot of times, right? So if they've gone out to a bar, or they're having fun or whatever, you may not be able to get everything out of them you need, or you may have to take more time to get the information you need. I had another thing where it was like 11 o'clock at night. I was having trouble sleeping. I took a couple Tylenol PM, right? Thinking I was going to get a great night's sleep. And then a half an hour later, somebody calls me, because you can't text me a major issue. You have to call me. That was our procedure, right? And so it's 11:30. The Tylenol PM starting to kick in. And now I've got to work all night, and I've got to try to figure out how to push through that, right? Not knowing what was going to happen or how that was all going to play out. It all goes into the mix when you have to deal with it.
Right. One of the things, as you were kind of talking through a little bit, that occurs to me is, do you have, or maybe the panel has, a couple of tools that they use? Are there tools that you use as part of this that might be a good tip for somebody who's planning?
We had a simple little device at all our locations that was very helpful, and not so much with being hacked, but just
it's called a kegerator.
Yeah, environmental. It was called a sensophone, and it was originally designed for people's vacation homes. And it was a phone that you could put into your system on a POTS line, and it would just monitor electric, it would monitor moisture, it would monitor air temperature, and all these different environmental variables. And that would just automatically call. And there was a list of like 5 numbers. So it would start at 1 and work its way through the phone book until somebody responded to it. Unfortunately, at one point I had someone working for me. They thought that meant they just had to silence it by hitting the silence code in. They didn't understand that meant something is really wrong and you can't just silence it and go back to bed. But the tool is only as good as the people that are responding to it.
Do you, Frank, did you have any ideas on tools?
We almost all of the stuff that we ended up doing was probably custom scripting in terms of responding to issues as they came up, but we used all kinds of monitoring tools to check, to check the viability of different things within our organization. So we would have, external monitors, internal monitors, and, what you were able to see after a while is that certain patterns of things were indicative of certain types of problems. And so having that flow through and being able to see certain alerts, if you knew what you were looking at. And so sometimes that was the difficult thing. Like, like there were probably 5 of us in the organization that could look at the alerts and, and pick them off and say, okay, wait a minute, if that just happened and that just happened, then where does that tell us, right? And kind of deduce where the actual issue was. So that's tricky as well. But a lot of it came down to centralizing documentation, scripting things in advance, and having good prepared checklists to go through when there were problems. But beyond that, I've used water water monitoring. Our facility in the Philippines was on the 4th floor of a 4-story building, and the roof leaked. So
Awesome.
we actually built like a sarcophagus for the data center. So we actually built like a building within the building that had its own roof that would let water off in case the ceiling breached. So we were very.
I do want to add here, incidentally, there is a double word score for using the term sarcophagus on the Powerlunch. So double word score, give yourself 20 extra points. Good job. That was awesome. And I guess from my perspective, one of the tools I use, and Paul's probably going to want to punch me in the face for saying this, is Trello. But Trello has recently been kind of not replaced, but there's other tools out there. Asana is a tool. Microsoft Teams has Planner, Tasks, those types of things. But it's a great place to identify lists and checklists of things to do. I also use mind maps. I use a product personally called XMind. Those are a great facilitation tool to help you identify processes and dependencies. So like I said, I use XMind, but there's a lot of different tools out there. But when you are facilitating the conversations with the operational units around how your business operates and where the dependencies lie, a mind map is a great tool to help visually describe how those interactions occur. Because a lot of times, I'm a visual person just anyway, but a lot of times an organization gets so focused on their little piece of it, right? This is my piece. I'm an expert in my piece. I don't care about these other pieces. But when we're IT people, when we're technology people, we need to think about how all of these pieces interact and the dependencies for all of them. And when you're doing a mind map, you're really visually able to describe that whole ecosystem and the dependencies within that ecosystem. And now it not only helps with the mapping of processes, but it helps with the contemplation and understanding of the breadth of what you have to do in your role. Because a lot of times, all of us who are in an IT space are responsible kind of for these incident response plans, even though IT is part of it, right? Because we want to be knowledgeable in all of it, but it helps kind of understand the breadth and scope and depth of the business, if that makes sense.
Sure. One thing that I find interesting that most people are talking, I guess, a little bit related to what you were saying, Keith, the processes and the interrelated things that people often don't think of, and they seem to be surprised when I bring it up, is they make everybody change their password, if they were hacked. And, everybody's got to change their password, change all the admin password. It's like, you got to change the service accounts as well. And they look at you like, what? It's like, yeah, think of those service accounts. They operate at system level, many of them. So if you don't go back and change those, someone got in, they're going to have these high level accounts that are still just sitting there. So something to think about when you're all these interlocking things. And back to processes, have you kept track of these service accounts? Do you know where they are? Do you know what they do? How is it going to affect your network or your systems? If you change an account on a goldmine server or a database server, what interlocks with that?
Right.
Yeah, and service accounts are kind of the necessary, but evil, right? Because you don't necessarily have the same mechanisms around multi-factor authentication around service accounts that you do around personal accounts, because there's nobody there to authenticate if they decide to prompt you. And there are other strategies, of course, to authenticate. And but our policy was always that any service account password had to be super complex and totally unique, right? So you couldn't reuse a password from another system and risk that service account password getting hacked because somebody discovered it somewhere else. So I think that's a good policy just in general for those types of accounts.
Yeah, and that's why we got into selling password automation tools, and Thycotic was one of them. And so it does password automation, just like it says, and changes passwords on a regular basis. So you don't have to manage those. You let the system manage those for you.
Great point.
I just, before we run out of time here, because I guess we are kind of getting relatively close, I just wanted to throw it out there to the floor and see, does anybody else have any questions about that? Anybody from the folks at large have anything that they wanted to ask to make sure that we talk about before we end the call today? Don't all ask at once.
I've got I was doing a little research prior to this because I wanted to just get back up to speed on something. And, one of the things that's still a little puzzling in the world is that there's really still no standard for breach notification. What you need to notify, how quickly you need to notify, who you need to notify. As I was looking at it, GDPR specifies 72 hours for a notification, but a lot of it is really set state by state. And so it's kind of interesting, and the laws in the state are almost impossible to read. So I think just one thing that I came into my head as I was approaching this is how many people really know what their obligations are to report a breach. And sometimes it's based on the number of people who were impacted. There's maybe a set period of time you need to notify. And then it depends on also what regulatory or compliance standards your company is keeping that might dictate what you have to do. So I think that's an area that, each of us for a particular business operating in one or multiple states or countries need to really pay attention to these days, because the laws are
there's a threshold that you have to notify. I can't remember if it's 300 or 500, but that's only if they're Florida people. So you could be breached and all those customers could be outside in another state. So you have to be familiar with those laws as well. Are you operating, like you said, in Europe and have to deal with that?
Right. And California is 500 and Arizona is 1,000. So if you could figure out that you didn't impact more than that number of people in those states. But what you end up doing is you probably end up having a policy where you notify anyway, right? And because you can't figure all of this out. And I think that, that's what I was getting out of looking at all of those, is that you probably have to set your own policy. And in a way, it has to be kind of greatest common denominator or least common denominator. You got to figure out what will work for you in almost every situation, so you don't compound the problem of a breach with legal action.
Right.
Very good.
So I kind of have a question that follows up with that, and it kind of depends on what kind of incident you're having, but what is something that you would try and say to these customers as a response to any of their things not being properly kept, or I guess not properly kept, but just so they know that you're still caring about what is happening with them?
Yeah, I look at the T-Mobile notification that they sent out. I thought it was pretty well crafted. And you're trying to basically tell customers you're still important to us, even though we were careless. Right?
Yeah, it's like almost a tale of two companies. If you look at what they did, then contrast it with the Kaseya issue that they had, where they let out. I mean, there was very little coming out from their organization. They didn't even say that it was a breach, actually, to start off with. They started it off with saying that they were having network challenges, or it was something of similar ilk.
They tried to hide from it, right?
They tried to hide from it, and I think that It's a couple of things, if I may. One is, it's a great thing if you can craft some responses ahead of time where when cooler heads prevail. I think that's a great way. And if you can work with somebody who maybe is in a marketing role or a customer facing role to help you with that communication and what it should be. In past lives and just in general, I think a communication plan, if you will, is part of an incident response plan. You have a communication plan as far as what you're going to tell vendors, what you're going to tell customers, what you're going to tell the public. Those things are all different communications. So I think that being able to do that ahead of time is a valuable component. Would you agree with that, Frank?
Oh, definitely. Again, just like think about when you're beginning the issue, it's not a convenient time and everybody's already tired, right? When it comes time to finally communicating to everybody, you're going to be even in worse shape. And, getting a hold of your marketing people in the middle of the night, not easy to do. So yeah, I've been yelled at by marketing, I don't know how many times, for sending out notifications because it was necessary, but they weren't available and, we needed to do something, right? So, and I felt like I communicate usually pretty well. And I think those communications really helped. But at the end of the day, they were, kind of ticked off that they weren't involved. So getting them involved ahead of time is a great idea in terms of trying to get the, the detail in there that they would want to see in there. And under the circumstances, someone in a senior position may still need to edit that and use that as input, not take it word for word based on the situation.
And having that plan gives you that structure. So if a customer asks for you can avail that to customers ahead of time so that your notification channels are identified. If a customer were to come back or somebody were to come back and say, hey, you know what, you didn't do this right, or you didn't notify enough, or whatever the case may be, if you have it identified ahead of time, you are able to say, well, this is the plan, and we executed according to the plan. Because your plan can be judged right or wrong or otherwise, but nonetheless, it's a plan. The absence of a plan, then that's where problems start to come. No plan is a problem. Having a poorly constructed plan is infinitely better than having no plan.
I agree with that, absolutely.
I've had a few different audit experiences, and having an answer is much better than looking surprised when they ask you a question. Even if it is
pretty much blood in the water and they're the sharks, right?
Yeah, so exactly.
I agree with you. You have to, they want to make sure you're paying attention. I mean, that's what a lot of this stuff comes down to.
Right. It's awesome. Are there any other questions for the panel, or are there any last thoughts that we would like to get out there?
Well, just talking about your planning, when you look at some of these regulatory agencies, SOX, HIPAA, things like that, if they walk into a situation and you've got no plan, they're going to come down on you pretty darn hard. But if you can show that you've been doing planning and hey, stuff happens, people get hacked. The big best companies in the world are getting hacked. So, but you've just got to show that you've done your due diligence. You might still take it on the chin a little bit, but you're not going to get crushed.
Right, we're not going to get crushed. That's exactly right.
We implemented ISO 27001 in our organization simply because there really wasn't a regulatory requirement, but we wanted to have a framework to be able to certify and be audited and follow a process and have the documentation and everything else. And so I think, a lot of people look at those types of initiatives as being particularly laborious. ISO in a lot of ways is something that you can make it what you want it to be, and there's bad examples of that, but you basically say how you want to comply or what you want to do. And as long as you meet their controls, then, you're pretty much good. So consider adopting a framework that helps you do that if you're not finding the discipline you need as an organization otherwise. And have people come in and do surveillance audits, once a year and certify 3 times a year and make it real.
Right. Very good. Well, I guess at this point, I'd like to thank you, Frank, for joining us. Always thanks to Paul, our generous benefactor and NetVPro. Thank you, Mr. Founder. And Frank, thank you very much. I look forward to having the opportunity to work with and hear from you in the future. And hopefully we'll see you in the Power Lunch once in a while, joining to be part of our technology community here.
For sure. Thank you. This was great.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. Power Lunch again. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.